Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Laukoff. Welcome to the LA Magazine Whiskey Festival. I'm a writer and editor, and I'm also the co-author of the new book, Big Backs and Burgundy, which is a great book about wine pairing, which also makes a great Christmas present, I must say. Welcome. I have the great pleasure of hosting tonight's LA Magazine Whiskey Festival, which is presented by Chow Now, which we are so happy to be partnering with because they share a love for local restaurants like Baltair, which many of you are enjoying right now. And unlike most delivery apps, Chow Now doesn't charge fees or commissions. Also, all your money goes directly to the restaurants. And right now, that's more important than ever when our takeout and delivery orders are sometimes the only things keeping our favorite restaurants afloat. So thank you, Chow Now, for supporting all the restaurants that we love. And just a quick note before we begin, if you'd like to show your support and share your photos of tonight's event, please tag at LA Mag and at Chow Now. So thanks for that. And now let's get on to the whiskey. We're going to start with Maker's Mark, and then we're going to move on to the Glenlivet. And it's my pleasure to introduce Maker's Mark's diplomat, Phil Olson, who's going to be walking us through some history of Maker's Mark and a tasting of Maker's 46 cask strength. Hi, Phil.
Hey, Adam. Thanks so much. Thanks for that great intro. Appreciate it.
You're a diplomat. You have to put a little more time in until you're an ambassador.
Well, see, and I'm sure some of them are on the call. Maker's Mark, we have a loyal army of ambassadors. So when they created my position, they needed to kind of change the title because we've got folks who've been ambassadors for Makers, almost 1 million of them for the past 10 years or so. They hopefully all got a beautiful deck of cards in the mail this year to pass the time while you're at home in quarantine. But our ambassador program is something I highly recommend to everybody. If you're a whiskey fan, it gets you first to know a lot of things and keeps you in touch with us at Makers. So
nice. So you're actually in the hierarchy. You're above ambassador as a diplomat.
No.
Oh, you're not.
I happen to pull a paycheck from Maker's Mark. I work directly for Maker's Mark. There is no hierarchy system there, and trust me, I've done enough events with enough ambassadors that sometimes when somebody introduces me not as a diplomat but as an ambassador, that group is very quick to correct them that no,
really?
He's a diplomat, I'm the ambassador, right? So that is a very common question that comes up.
All right, we got it right. Well, hey, I've been drinking Makers forever. Probably my favorite bourbon, and I'm a bourbon drinker, so it's fun to be talking to you tonight. And just a quick note, if any of you guys have questions at home, just type them into the chat, and Phil will get to them. We'll get to them down the line. But right now, why don't you take us through a little history of Makers and about Makers 46 cask strength?
Absolutely. So I think there should be 2 samples that came out. Maker's cask strength is the first one that we'll taste. And I think, like you said, we're going to talk a lot about history. So I think we're going to talk about the most purest form of Makers that you can get, which is what are the purest form of the vision of our founders. So if you want to pour yourself a little of that would be amazing at home. I'm going to do the same here. Little cask strength Makers. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit about our history. I don't know if we want to start the slides that we've got while I go through this and kind of talk a little bit about who we are and what we've done for the past 60-ish years or so. But you can jump to the next slide here. Sorry, that's just my cover there. We can't talk about Makers without talking about our founding family. Maker's Mark was founded by a husband and wife team, Bill and Margie Samuels. They met each other at engineering school at the University of Louisville. Margie was the valedictorian. Bill barely graduated. And whenever there was an argument at the dinner table, all that Margie had to do was really point at those diplomas on the wall and just make sure that Bill understood, maybe you don't want to push it on this one. As you can see, I've got a little more in my back pocket than you do as far as getting around this. So that photo is one of my favorite photos of them. That is them at the reopening of the T.W. Samuels Distillery after Prohibition. So T.W. Samuels, T. William Samuels, aka Bill Samuels. Bill Samuels inherited his family's distillery and inherited his family's whiskey brand. But it turns out he didn't like his family's whiskey all that much. So in 1943, they actually sold that distillery and started something completely new. Eventually, they brought their son in the mix, Bill Samuels Jr. We can jump to the next slide here. Bill Jr., he took over for Bill and Margie, and his job really was to go find customers, right? Bill and Margie created the product. Bill's job was to go out and sell it. And then eventually he retired about 10 years ago, and he passed the reins down to his son, Rob, who is running our distillery right now. And actually, Maker's Cask Strength was not on the market until Rob took over, because that's how he likes to enjoy his whiskey. He likes it at that full barrel proof. And so that's what we're going to enjoy today. With Maker's Cask Strength, I get a ton of citrus. I get that classic bourbon, vanilla, and caramel, but I also get a touch of spice, some like black cherry notes, some cola notes. It's one of my absolute favorite expressions. So if you want to sip along with Cask Strength while we talk about what we do at Maker's now and how we continue to produce our whiskey the same way our founders intended, that'd be lovely. And then when we finish, we'll taste a little of what we're working on now and what the future of Maker's Mark kind of holds. So we can go ahead to the next slide. That's Bill and Rob in the distillery. And they, that handover was pretty amazing. And Maker's 46 was actually the retirement project of Bill Samuels Jr. before he handed the reins down to his son, Rob. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that part of our presentation. But I want to talk a little bit about the distillery itself. So if we jump to the next slide, this is actually the distillery that Bill and Margie bought. So like I said, they had sold off the T.W. Samuels distillery in the 40s, but in 1953, they bought this distillery. And this, at that time, was called the Burke Springs Distillery. And they bought it, and Bill looked at it and he said, man, this thing is ancient. I am ready to start from scratch. What do we got to do to just level this and build something new? But Margie knew that would have been a mistake. So she convinced him to restore it. So if we jump to the next slide, you can see what that same site looks like now. And it doesn't look much different. We maintained that property. That property was built in the 1880s, right? And so we maintain that kind of old, true backwoods Kentucky whiskey, handmade at the source. And when we talk about that site in Loretto, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about something really special about it, which is our water source. So Bill didn't buy this because of the existing distillery. Like I said, he wanted to tear it down, and it was Margie who convinced him to restore it. Side note, it is a National Historic Landmark now. Thank you to Margie for making sure we maintained and restored it. But if you jump to the next slide, this is what Bill was after. This is our own lake, our spring-fed limestone water source right sitting on our property. We own 1,000 acres surrounding this lake in order to protect that watershed and make sure that lake quality and mineral content and pH level is the same now as it was when Bill bought it, and will be the same for the next 100 years. So we continue to make Maker's Mark taste the way we all have come to love. So that lake is crucial to everything we do. And like I said, mineral content, limestone filtered. All bourbon distillers should sit here and tell you about the limestone in their water, but not all bourbon distillers can tell you that they own their entire watershed and really have exclusive access to that water source, so we can control that pH and that mineral content, which our yeast and our grains absolutely love. They love our water. So if you go to the next slide, talks about our grains. We're pretty open with our mash bill. We don't really hide behind it. Like all bourbons, it's mostly corn, that 51% corn ratio we absolutely adhere to. We go a little higher. We go 70% corn. We go 16% of soft red winter wheat. The wheat we use in our whiskey actually comes from a farm 9 miles down the road. We buy all our wheat from within Marion County, the county where the distillery sits, from the Peterson family, and we continue to buy from them today. And that's what Bill Sr. bought from back in the 1950s. And then that last 14% is malted barley, which brings that enzyme, but also brings body, brings structure, and that is our mash bill. We take those grains, we roller mill them, and if you go to the next slide, we then cook them in atmospheric cooking. That's a key thing. A lot of folks will use pressure cookers. They're going for a different flavor than us. I'm not going to say anybody's doing anything wrong. They're just looking for a different goal. That doesn't maintain the integrity of that grain. We worked really hard to source these amazing grains. We don't want to overcook them and completely pulverize them. We want to use a nice atmospheric cook when we cook them. We also mill them differently too. So before they hit this cooker, they actually used a roller mill as opposed to a hammer mill. Makes it so the starch is dissolvable in that hot water, but the protein and the oil and the husk and all those other things we don't want to dissolve is not. So that's going to float up. We're not going to kind of get that like wood fermentation or those other off flavors because of the way we mill our grains. So we've milled them very carefully. We've used that precious lake water. We've cooked them very carefully. Then we add them to our fermentation. So if you jump to the next slide, these are our Cypress fermentation tanks. This beautiful stained glass was just installed by Rob a couple of years ago, and absolutely gorgeous, overlooking our property. But these wooden fermentation tanks, not all of our fermentation tanks are wood. Like I said, we're a National Historic Landmark. So if you ask some of the production guys if they would love to replace these with stainless or something else, they might say yes, but we do maintain them because of that landmark status, that historical status. But we do this fermentation. We do a 3-day fermentation. Our native yeast, right? We use the Samuel's family yeast. We propagate our own yeast on site. We're not bringing in anything else. And that yeast has this amazing floral, a little bit citrusy, almost a little kind of tart flavor to it. That's absolutely beautiful. Think about it like an amazing Hefeweiss with a little bit of like citrus to it. That's what the flavors that our yeast brings to the party. So we've all these things are building flavor, right? So we've got lake water, we've got grains, milk, like source particular, milled particularly, cooked particularly, meeting our family yeast and all working together, right? We take that fermented wort and we run it through distillation. So if you jump to the next slide, these are our copper stills. We've actually got 3 identical versions of the same still. You can see right here, it's not that big of a still, right? When we expanded and when we decided that we as a brand needed to figure out a way to make more whiskey, it would have been really easy for us to kind of build a newer, bigger still. But we realized we didn't know how to do that all that well. But what we could do is replicate the same process we're doing over and over and over again. So those fermenters we just looked at, those are 10,000 gallons. We run those through this size still. We have 3 versions of the same thing. And then that fills about 20 barrels for us, right? So we distill up to 120 proof on our first distillation, second distillation to 130 proof. And that is... we bring that down to 110 before it goes into the barrel. And when it goes into the barrel, fills about 20-ish barrels depending on the run. But it is in that range typically. And that's kind of, those batch sizes have not changed since the 1950s, right? One of my colleagues always likes to make the joke, if you ever want to come and visit a functioning 1950s distillery, just come to Maker's Mark, because we haven't changed our production methods all that much. We've maybe added a little technology here and there, but there's still folks by hand stopping at every step in this process and making sure it's done the right way, the way we've always done it, because that is how we maintain Bill and Margie's vision for this product. So if you want to jump to the next slide, talk about our barrels. We use American white oak barrels, just like most bourbon distillers. We char them to a number 3 level char. I know some people love a number 4. Some people experiment with different chars. We like char number 3, but a key component of our barrels is that we let them sit, the wood for the barrels, sit outside for a full year, 9 months plus the full Kentucky summer before we turn them into a bourbon barrel. What that outdoor seasoning does is it gives a head start for those flavor compounds to develop. The bitter flavors wash out, tannins wash out, vanilla, caramel flavors really come to the surface as that wood degrades and seasons outside before we turn it into a bourbon barrel. Once we turn it into a bourbon barrel, like I said, char number 3, we fill it with that 110 proof new distillate. And if you go to our next slide, we put it into our rick house. Something key to remember that we do that almost every bourbon distillery used to do, but now we're kind of the only ones left doing it, is we rotate our barrels. If you think about Maker's Mark, and you've probably had this in the past, if you're trying it for the first time today, maybe you've seen this, from 1959 to 2010, this is pretty much all we sold was this product right here, right? And commercially widely available. And so we needed to make sure every drop, every bottle, every barrel tasted exactly the same. So when new barrels get filled, they get put to the top of our warehouses, and then we rotate them by hand down to the lower floors of the warehouse in order to get that consistency of flavor, barrel to barrel, batch to batch, bottle to bottle. When I got this job, I trained at the distillery for about a month and tried to do every job at the distillery. I tried to do this job and help the guys rotate barrels. Turns out you have to be extremely strong, quick, smart, and coordinated. I am not any of those things, so it did not work out well for me. They did not keep me around for more than just the one day I was with them. But it's absolutely fascinating to watch, and we still do every barrel hand rotated in order to make sure that we're getting the consistent flavor barrel to barrel throughout. We can go ahead to the next slide now. We'll talk about the bottle, right? So that's all the things that Bill Sr. put in place in order to make our whiskey taste a certain way, the way that it tastes in your glass right now, right? He wanted it to be a front palate whiskey. He wanted it to be heavy in vanilla and caramel and all those amazing sweet flavors. He didn't want it to blow your ears back, though. He still wanted it to be easy to drink, approachable, but still complex and full flavored. So you get a little bit of citrus, a little bit of spice, a little bit of cherry, all these really amazing notes, but it's still easy to drink. And what you're drinking now is at cask strength, right? So it's a little higher proof and it's still super pleasant, super easy to drink. So that was what he did. And he was ready to just throw it in any old bourbon bottle and call it Old Samuel's Bourbon. Here we go. And Margie keeps saving the day. Margie stepped in and said, what? No, we already sold off TW samples. We can't just call it something else. Can't put it in any old barrel. So that bottle on the left that you see, that's the first bottle of Maker's Mark. And as you can see, as the bottle on the right, a new bottle of Maker's Mark hasn't changed all that much. So that's Margie's design. She designed the bottle. It's her handwriting on the label, hand dipped every bottle in wax. If you jump to the next slide, that's our print shop right now in 2020. Hasn't changed. We're cutting those labels on that printing, on that antique press, that hand die cutter. We're cutting them that way. The next label, the next slide, please. We're still dipping every bottle by hand. Again, like I said, when I was at the distillery training, I had to do this job for a day too. They actually just sent me home early. I did not have the patience or the attention to detail for this. The teams of folks who do this day in, day out are amazing at it, and they make sure every bottle has that amazing dripping tendrils there, and they absolutely are just perfect for this. So not my job that I would necessarily be great at, but the people who do it amazingly well. So that's where we've been. That's Maker's Mark. That's how we got here. That's everything we did. Fast forward a few years, Bill and Margie have retired. They've passed down to their son, Bill Jr. Bill Jr. is getting ready to retire and pass everything down to his son, Rob, and he says, I want to have my own whiskey, right? Like I did everything I could to maintain my parents' whiskey, bring it out to the world, sell it to as many people as possible, and he did an amazing job at that. But how do I make a new whiskey and make it for my legacy? So let's move to the next slide. And let's talk about wood finishing. This is our limestone bourbon aging cellar. It's the only one of its kind in the entire Commonwealth of Kentucky. We have dynamited out the side of a hill, built this cellar into the hill in order to maintain these cooler temperatures in there, because we found that with this unique stave finishing process we use, we need those cooler temperatures. So if you jump to the next slide, we will talk about what happens in that cellar. So if you look at these slides, right, we've got two different photos here. We have the staves themselves on the right, and we have a barrel with staves being added to it on the left. So what we do to go from Maker's Mark, the Maker's cask strength in the glass you have in front of you, we actually take the whiskey out of the barrel. We take 10 pieces of seared French oak that you can see on the right. So this is French oak, higher in tannins, much more, going to add a lot of body, going to add a totally unique flavor. We're going to put those on a non-reactive metal ring. We're going to put them into the center of that barrel. We're going to put the same whiskey we just took out of the barrel back in. We're going to seal it up, and we're going to put it away for 9 extra weeks. And that's how we create Maker's 46. So if you jump to the next slide, you can see that wood of oak specifically, it's almost flavor neutral until you cook it. So we're taking French oak, flavor neutral, we're cooking it to a certain temperature to emphasize certain types of flavor. So for Maker's 46, we're almost dead center in this graph. Vanilla, spicy, toasty, honey. We've brought all these flavors to the party. Comes with a little dark fruit, lengthens the finish. Really, really unique version of Maker's Mark. So if Bill and Margie got to make their perfect version of bourbon by creating Maker's Mark, Bill Jr. got to make his perfect version of that bourbon by creating Maker's 46. So if you jump to the next slide, you'll see that's the bourbon aging cellar on the interior. So once that barrel gets refilled, this is where it rolls to, and it sits there for 9 extra weeks. And that after those 9 weeks, it becomes Maker's 46. And you guys are in for a real treat today. What we're actually going to taste next is actually Maker's 46 at cask strength. So cask strength Maker's 46. This is the first year we've ever released this nationwide. We've only ever just put it in our gift shop in Kentucky here and there. But because this is the 10th year of Maker's 46 hitting the market, we decided to do a wider release of this. So if this is something you're not a ton of it went out, I really hope you enjoy it, because it's not something we're producing a ton of, and we're really excited to share it with you. And I think that's it for the slides that we've prepared. Thank you so much, Adam. Would love to have you jump back on, and we can taste a little whiskey and talk about it if you don't mind.
Hey, thanks for that. That it's fascinating. So I actually had the joy of visiting the Makers Distillery last year on a press trip, and actually Rob Samuels, who's such a nice guy, gave us the tour himself, which was amazing. And I actually, a little show and tell here, I got to dip my own bottle.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, did a pretty good job with the drip.
Yeah, absolutely, you got some good tendrils. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I've had to fight opening this so many times. But it was like, it was like, oh, I have a bottle of Makers, so I can't open this one. But anyway, I remember one of the things that I remember about the tour. The facility there, I mean, it's almost like a fiefdom. It's so huge, and it's beautiful. I don't know if your pictures quite did justice to how sort of bucolic.
I would encourage, if you've never been, if you're listening and you want to go to Kentucky and see an amazing Kentucky distillery, there's honestly nothing like Maker's Mark. It's absolutely gorgeous. So I agree. I've yet to find photos that do it justice. There's just something about, as you're walking down the hill from the visitor center, the smell that hits you, the rolling green hills in the springtime, it's just, there's nothing that can replicate that outside of going and visiting yourself.
Yeah, it really is. It's sort of in this magical land of these winding hills, these sugarloaf hills, and winding streets, and then you get to this sort of amazing spot out there. And you guys bought a bunch more acres surrounding the original site, and I'm curious and I got to see the limestone lake, which is beautiful, and I'm wondering, so. And one of the things I took away from the whole thing, well, there's a lot of things. I want to ask you about the yeast too, first of all, eventually. But the limestone lake, you're so serious about the water there, and I'm curious, what is it about the sort of specific features of that water do you think that sort of leads to the taste of Makers specifically?
So, short answer is mineral content, right? Like limestone. Yeah. Filtered water in central Kentucky through Tennessee, southern Indiana. That's why so many distilleries are there, because that water is so prevalent there. So that's like the short answer, right? But everybody has access to that, right? Like you can open the tap in Kentucky and you get amazing limestone filtered water, right? Like, so the what we have beyond that is the pH, the ecosystem that's around it, right? So we can control not only the lake itself, but the watershed that would run into that lake, or that would drip down and come back up through the springs into that lake. So that's why all that acreage was purchased, is not only to maintain the mineral content of that lake, which is changes over time, I would assume, but to maintain the quality of the water itself, the pH level, the acidity of it. Our yeast, like you brought up yeast, our yeast loves the acidity level that our lake water sits at. So it's like a beautiful, like they just work so well together. Yeah. We want to make sure that they both continue to operate as best they can. So everything we can do to protect the lake itself is going to keep our yeast really happy, which is going to make our whiskey taste really good, right? Like it's this kind of like layers on layers on layers.
And you mentioned that it's the family yeast, and I remember it was sort of almost felt like it was very well guarded when I was there. Is this sort of a yeast that's been passed down for a long time? And how does that work?
So where the initial strain started being propagated by the Samuels family, I don't know that I have the answer to that. But I can tell you that when Bill Sr. sold off the T.W. Samuels distillery, the legend goes that he burned the family recipe, right? But the one thing he didn't do was give up the family yeast. So he found a way to maintain it, or he froze it essentially, right? Cryogenic, store it while he wasn't making whiskey. So then when they went back to making whiskey, he could bring that back and maintain that kind of family history throughout. And it's not just the sentimental part of using the yeast strain that's handed down to me. It just works really well with the wheat in our recipe. Like I said, that lake water, they just work so harmoniously together that it just makes our whiskey taste amazing. So yeah, we do our best to maintain it. We have it stored safely offsite so that if we ever need to restart propagation we can from the original strain, but it is there's a team of folks who they grow yeast for us. That's their job, and I think that's one of the most amazing things. Like, we've interjected technology wherever we can throughout the distillery because it exists and it's a benefit and we should all use it, but we still know that the human touch of somebody who smells and tastes and knows how it's supposed to go can't be replaced. So there are still humans' hands growing that yeast, propagating it every day in order to add to those fermenters once that mash pours in order to keep our whiskey tasting the same way now that it did in the 1950s.
And I'll never forget those giant old wood barrels and this sort of bubbling. It was just thousands of little bubbles coming up from the fermentation. Yeah,
that's exactly what it is. That's the chemical reaction of yeast hitting the sugar in that mash, which came from us cooking it, right? We cooked the starch down to sugar by the barley, the wheat mixed with the corn. That's why you can't just do corn. You got to add that barley malt. It converts all that starch into sugar. The yeast eats that sugar, creates flavor, but also creates carbon dioxide, creates alcohol, and that chemical reaction causes all those bubbles. That's all those carbon dioxide bubbles coming up. And if you'll notice, sometimes it's slower bubbles than not. But one of the cool things I think about makers is actually when the bubbles are slower, it's because all the things that didn't get milled down floated to the top, and you actually have really active, really amazing fermentation happening underneath. And so we get this really amazing fermentation. Like I said, it's this weird perfect storm of that pure lake water, the really amazing grains milled to a certain style, the amazing yeast fermented in the right size quantities, where it creates this really beautiful, efficient fermentation that also builds like really, really great flavor.
Yeah. And okay, so I have so many questions. We only have a certain amount of time, but I got to visit that beautiful cave, the Cove Cave that you've built into the limestone. And one of the things was this private barrel program that sort of seems fascinating to me. And I know that so you're able to go there and actually put your own staves in whatever combination to create sort of your own sort of finished flavor. And I'm curious, sort of, what's the combination of these staves? I know you said that it was French oak for 46 that sort of makes 46, but what are the sort of other combinations you're able to add in terms of staves, in terms of wood? And have you tried, different versions of those combinations, and how does it really affect it?
It has an amazing effect, right? Even so for 46, it's 10 French oak staves for 9 weeks. So we kept those kind of ground rules in place for this private barrel program. So it's a combination of 10 different staves in the barrel for 9 extra weeks. But there's 5 different stave types. 4 of them are French, 1 of them's American, and they're all cooked differently. So at one point in the deck, there's a like time versus temperature graph. So if you cook wood, so let's use one of my favorite staves, for example. We call it the mocha stave. It's cooked almost like you would cook coffee, right? You take a raw French oak stave, you cook it at high heat for a long time, and almost burnt. When it gets burnt, it turns acrid, it turns bitter. But just before it burnt, all these flavors come out: dark chocolate, coffee, nutty, almond, all these things. So we do that. We cook that piece of wood almost like you would a coffee bean to bring out those flavors in the wood, and those are the flavors it adds to the whiskey. So there's 5 different combinations. You, as somebody selecting the barrel, would choose 10, a combination of 10. That leads to 1,001 different flavor combinations. And you'd be amazed, even some that are only different by 1 stave taste markedly different, right? Like that 1 stave could completely change the nature of the whiskey, and that's the beauty of it. So like Bill Jr. got to expand that, and that's how it was born, truly. Bill Jr., so Rob Samuels understands like modern bourbon consumers have a different expectation than maybe what his grandparents were dealing with, right? We like cask strength whiskey, we like single barrels and store picks, we like these things. But being a distillery that's only done one thing for so long, Rob's really tried to make sure that when we do something new, we do it the right way, right? So he and Jane Bowie, our head of innovation, they were really trying to figure out, how do we do a barrel program that still fits the maker's way? And Bill Jr., even though he was retired, Rob's dad, he's retired. He still shows up all the time. And he was just like, well, the most fun I ever had at the distillery was when I get to experiment with different types of oak and make my perfect version of Maker's Mark. And it was like, you could literally see the light bulb above Rob's head of like, well, let's just let people do that. Let's figure out how to let people do that. And that's where private selection was born. Our single barrel program, we call it Maker's Private Selection. This is one of those bottles, if you've seen it around. The label has changed slightly recently, but these are still around, especially here in California. This is probably what you'll see on the shelf. And each barreling is completely different.
Wow. Well, I guess I wanted to ask you the one last question. So you say you add wheat to Makers, and you often hear, and I feel like I've always felt like I like wheated bourbon, but I don't necessarily always know which bourbon is wheated. I also don't know why I like wheated bourbon more than other kinds of bourbon. Why do you think? Why, like, what is it about adding that wheat, and why do they say, when they say it's wheated, what does that do to the flavor?
So think about rye bread versus wheat bread, right? So most bourbons on the market are made with corn by law, right? But usually they use rye and a touch of malted barley as the flavoring grains or the small grains in the mash. We're swapping out that rye for wheat, and flavor-wise, what that does, think about whole wheat versus rye bread. One's going to be spicy, intense, that like spicy pumpernickel, and one's going to be more sweet, right? A little more like soft and round. And that's that whole wheat bread, right? And so that's really it. It's truly a flavor-driven decision of how do we make something that's not going to be too bitter, too spicy, not going to blow your ears back. And for Bill, for his flavor preference, Bill Senior, it was wheat. That was the difference. And so, I personally have a sweet tooth. I am drawn to wheated bourbons. I was drawn to Maker's Mark before I worked for it. It was one of my favorites, and I wanted to work for this brand because I have that sweet tooth. I prefer wheated bourbons 9 times out of 10 because I naturally prefer sweeter flavors.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I guess that's the sort of secret ingredients, maybe, that why we love Makers.
We don't call it a secret. Like, we'll just tell everybody what it is. But yes, we'll.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Of course. Hey, Phil, thank you so much. It's been great. I had so many more questions for you, but I think I guess we have to move on, sadly.
All right. We'll do this. You and I will get together when we can do it in person, and we'll go through all these questions.
Yeah, please. I love that. Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. And cheers.
Appreciate it. Cheers.
All right. Well, I guess we are going to move on to the Glenlivet, and our next presenter, who sorry, Dom, are you there? Oh, sorry. You know what? Actually,
I got a
trivia question. My bad. So
sorry, Dom.
Apologies. We're live here. So this is to win a Maker's Mark gift box, and the winner you have to be in LA to win the prize. But here's the question. Where did Bill and Margie Samuels meet each other? And multiple choices: Tinder, introduced by friends, grew up next door to each other, or were classmates in engineering school. And we will let you guys weigh in. First person to weigh in wins. Drum roll. Oh, good drum roll.
Good try.
Hold on. Everybody's racing to the finish here. Hold on. Well, first person. What do we see?
Don't all shout at once.
Oh, here we go.
All right, Jeff.
All right, Jeff. Congratulations. Getting a nice Maker's gift box. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Well, Phil, it was great talking to you. We're going to move on to the Glenlivet. But take care.
Thanks, Adam.
Hopefully we'll talk soon. All right, man. And okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce whiskey specialist for the Glenlivet, Dominic Vanega, who is going to be telling us about the Glenlivet 12-year-olds. Dominic, how are you, babe?
I'm doing great. How are you? That was a great little session we just had with Phil.
It is.
Well, we have a lot of questions as well.
By the way, if you guys don't have beards at home, we're gonna make up for it
it's
tonight.
it's part of the whiskey, thing.
Apparently, apparently. So yeah, it's good to see you. So first of all, why is it the Glenlivet? Let's just start. I just wanted to throw that out there. Not Glenlivet, but the Glenlivet.
All right.
And do you have to say the Glenlivet?
We do have to say the Glenlivet.
Yeah, you did.
And that's by law. And to just let you guys know that are watching, I don't have any PowerPoint. I do like to talk, and I do like to get you involved. And as well, you do have that little bottle of Glenlivet 12 in front of you. So I do ask you, please get ready, pour it. Let's get ready. We had some bourbon, which was delicious, really full-bodied bourbon. Now we're going to use some of that DNA from that bourbon and move over to Scotland and go on a Scotch journey now through Glenlivet. All right. Now, Glenlivet, what's Glenlivet mean? Well, Glen translates to valley. Livet translates to smooth flowing one. And is also the name of the river that flows through the Glenlivet Valley that is off the main river Spey, which is known for Speyside. All right. So Glenlivet. All right. When we started in 1824, we are the single malt that started it all. And that's just not some marketing phrase. It's actually the truth. We were the first licensed distillery in the Northern Highlands of Scotland in 1824. Now, when we did that, our founder, George Smith, was making illicit whiskey in the braes of Glenlivet, or in the valleys of Glenlivet. Now, if you go up to Glenlivet nowadays, it pretty much resembles what it was 200 years ago. And we're coming up on our 200th anniversary here in 4 years, which is pretty amazing. So rolling green hills, just gorgeous, gorgeous places. Now, Glenlivet, the distillery, we sit at 900 feet above sea level. And we pretty much sit at the top of the valley, which is Glenlivet Valley. Now, within this valley, we can see all the tax guys coming up where we were illicit stilling to come, tear down our stills or collect taxes, right? So the Glenlivet was kind of known for being this really delicious whiskey that never got caught or tore down because of where it was located. Now, the Glenlivet, if we go to the distillery today, you can see that right next door to us, we have Glenfiddich, we have Aberfeldy, we have Aberlour, we have Macallan. The Speyside Valley has 50 distilleries, the most distilleries in any region in the world, right? And we have a lot of different kind of whiskeys. So when we started the Glenlivet in 1824, within 20 years of us starting our distillery, we had a lot of other distilleries, our neighbors, also start distilleries, right? So you had Macallan, you had Aberlour, you had Aberfeldy, these ones that I just mentioned. Well, as they opened, they also said that they were Glenlivet. So that didn't really rest well with any of our family from the Smith family. So in the 1880s, we actually took everyone to court and said, hey, listen, we are Glenlivet. We started the distillery. Our whiskey is known as Glenlivet. This is ours. Well, the courts agreed with us, kind of, right? They said, all right, you guys are right. You're the first. So you are the Glenlivet. Now, everybody else, you can still put Glenlivet. You can put it hyphenated on your label. You can add it just so you know where you're coming from, right? So it's almost like saying we're from Napa Valley. Right, Napa Valley, right. But within Napa Valley, you have a lot of great regions that grow great grapes, and if you want certain styles, people knowing from Speyside or the Highlands, they know that, but from Glenlivet. So after we did that, we got the Glenlivet. Now, if you still go to some of these distilleries, you'll see that it says Aberlour Glenlivet, Macallan Glenlivet, because they're from the Glenlivet Valley. All right. Now, I also like to say people also always kind of think that us as whiskey ambassadors or producers that we're all against each other. And just like Phil had touched upon in Kentucky about being a very big family community thing, it's the same thing in Scotland. Very, very, very passion driven. It's all about the whiskey. It's not about how it looks, how old it is. As an American, I remember my first time to Scotland and sitting at a table in a pub, and I had a gentleman come approach a table of four of us, and he put 5 shots on the table. He said, "Welcome to Scotland," and of course, a couple of us from the United States were like, well, what is it? And he's like, it's just whiskey. Just drink it. Who cares how old it is, where it's coming from? And it's kind of the same way when you go to Kentucky. They're like, you don't need to look at it too long. You don't need to just drink the whiskey. It's made to be drank. But yes, so the Glenlivet, we are the Glenlivet because of this lawsuit. So you will see the on other brands. I'm not sure by law if they're allowed to have it on or not, but by law, we are the Glenlivet.
The Glenlivet. And so you say Speyside, and does Speyside and Glenlivet, are they mutually exclusive? In the Venn diagram, is the Glenlivet part of Speyside is that a larger area that sort of
so you have the
Yeah.
Highlands, right? So in the Highlands you have all these distilleries, and then you have a small little area of Speyside, which is in the Scottish Highlands. So actually, I had a trick question. I didn't put it through because I didn't want to be mean to everyone that was asking. But I was, where is Glenlivet from? If you said the Highlands, you wouldn't be wrong. If you said Speyside, you wouldn't be wrong.
Okay.
But you know, but we are pretty much in Speyside, and I like to tell people, when you look at other Highland distilleries, most of them are going to be on near the shore. So you have Talisker, you have Highland, you have these other ones that are going to be close to the ocean. Whereas if you go to Speyside, I'm here in California, so I always say it's almost like the equivalent of going to Fresno. There's nothing around there. There's no sea salt. None of that water is going to be imparted into our peat or into that barley. So there's a lot that goes on, right? And we're known in Speyside for being fruity and floral, right? And I say that as a marketing ploy, because if you do spend time in Speyside, you will know that you can get a peated whiskey, you can get a very floral whiskey, a very rich whiskey, a very sherried whiskey. You know, for the style of Glenlivet, we're a very light style whiskey when you compare it to something like Macallan, which is very sherry driven, right? If you look at your bottle, and I hope that you're imbibing. I should imbibe with you. Now, as we're tasting this, I just want to give a little tasting.
Yeah, let's taste some.
Into it. Something that I like to tell people is when George Smith developed Glenlivet, he wanted this characteristic of a pineapple. He wanted that flavor. And I always say, well, did he even see a pineapple in 1820? How would he know? And if he did see it, it was something that was very magical, right? I like to say, if you're strong enough to take a pineapple and just crack it in half, that smell of that fresh cut pineapple is what you get in the nose of the Glenlivet. And that's what he wanted. He wanted that nice floral, easy scent, right? Now, we just had Maker's Mark, which is delicious, really big, full bodied. Now, you had the 46, you had some strong whiskeys, right?
Yeah.
We're going right down to 80 proof, right? So this is Glenlivet 12. This is our flagship. This is the Speyside malt that everyone wants to beat, right? So Glenlivet 12, we're known for being just light, floral. You have that pineapple. I like to say you have orchard fruit as well. So when we taste it, you're going to taste a lot of apple and pear. And it's a really nice, soft finish.
May I? Okay.
Now, at Glenlivet, as you can see, I call that my apple juice. I mean, as you can see behind me, I have my rainbow of Glenlivet, which is a great thing, right? So I want to touch upon what we just talked about with Maker's Mark and what Phil said about that bourbon barrel and how much love goes into it, and the toasting and the charring, and a lot of thought process goes, right? But by law, they're not allowed to use that barrel again, right? And Maker's Mark is pretty adamant about, hey, we're not using this barrel again. We sell them, right? So we can sell them to Mexico. We can sell them to the rum producers. Scotch or Japan want them. And why do they want that? Why do they want that American oak? Well, there's a lot of points that Phil told you, but mainly it's because of that whiskey that's been in that barrel, right? So we have a lot of things that we say. So we take a lot of barrels to age our whiskey in. So when we get a barrel for the first time, say for Maker's Mark, we put our whiskey into it. And the first time that we do that, we call it a first fill, right? So you want to think about that. And I always tell people, okay, that first fill, think about it like a tea bag, right? You put that tea bag in your first cup. It's really rich, a lot of flavors coming through. That's what you're going to get from that first fill. That wood is still wet with the whatever whiskey it held before, so that bourbon, and that's going to leach into whatever we put into that barrel, right? Now let's talk about that barrel, that first fill. So whatever is going to come through, you're going to get that vanilla, that toffee, that butterscotch that is known in bourbon. That's going to come through into the single malt scotch, right? Well, we can use that barrel once, twice, 3, 4 times. Now think about it again, like the tea bag. Second or third time, you're getting a little color, a little flavor, not too much. Once you get to that fourth, it's almost just holding the whiskey. Now we can use those second and third fills to add these flavor components that you wouldn't normally get in like a bourbon, right? A bourbon, we're only using 1 cask. When I look at the way that we make a single malt, is that we have a bunch of casks to work from. So I always like to say that there's a lot of American bourbon DNA in our scotches. Now it could be from Maker's Mark, it could be from Jim Beam, it could be from Old Forester. We don't have contracts with just one distillery. We buy barrels from everyone, right? It depends on who we're buying it from, what whiskey, how fresh they are. Now we'll use those barrels over and over, but like I said, that second and third fill, those are flavor components that we might want to come through, just not too much like it would in the first fill. So having all of these kind of components to use and to blend to make that single malt, and just a little sidebar so people that may not have tasted single malt whiskey before. Single just means one distillery. So single malt single distillery is Glenlivet. Malt, well, we have to malt our whiskey. So what is malting? Well, we take barley, dry barley, we harvest it, we take it to our malting floor, add water to it. Now that malt is going to slowly sprout. Now we need it to dry when it's just got enough sugars. Now that's kiln drying. Now a lot of areas in Scotland, you'll know they dry it in different ways. Now in Glenlivet, we dry it with hot air. So think about hot air. It's not imparting any flavor, right? Now in other parts, now at Glenlivet, we did used to peat our whiskey, all right? Until the early 1980s, we actually did use peat in Glenlivet. So the peat that we have at Glenlivet, though, right next to our distillery, a little peat bog, that's not going to be imparted with any sea salt like you would at Lefroy or Lagavulin, that's surrounded by water and getting just crashed with all this beautiful notes and that sea salt and the iodine. Where we're at, we're going to be a little more sweeter peat. It's going to, because we have a lot of heather on those hills around us in Glenlivet. So that's what's dying down and going into that soil. So when we take those peat bricks and we dry our barley before we, get into fermentation, that's going to impart. Now, if we're in Islay, yeah, that's going to be a very peaty, smoky Scotch because of that peat, right? If we're using peat from our area, so next door we have Balvenie, right, with Glenfiddich, they're going to know their peat style is a little more sweeter. I would say a sweet peat. I wouldn't say it's so like if you open a bottle of Lefroy, you're like, ooh, that comes through, and that smoke is very strong. So I always like to tell people, think about where your peat's coming from. You got to think about your regions, right? So, but just know that a lot of us in the Scottish Highlands and in Speyside, a lot of us do not use peat. Some do. The Balvenie does peated whiskey. So that's
and so there's no peat. There's no peat in the Glenlivet, or
no peat. But I want to be just, since you saw the color of the rainbow, and this is only about half of what we have out, right? So within our portfolio, we do have a brand called Nadura, which translates in Gaelic to natural. And there's 3 releases. We have a virgin American oak cask, we have a Oloroso sherry cask, and we have a peated cask. Just because we want to put our whiskey into it and we can release it so people know what our whiskey tasted like when it was peated. But I will tell you, it's not. It's a peated cask from Islay, so that smoke's very aggressive, right? It's not what we would have normally. If you're lucky enough to taste a bottle from like even the 60s, 70s of that Glenlivet, you do taste that soft smoke that you would get, and it's a luxurious thing, but it's something to see. I mean, I always tell people with whiskeys, economics and what goes on in the other countries that are buying our whiskeys is what affects our whiskey, right? So the reason that most of us in Scotland were peated and not peated is because of what was happening here in the United States. Americans weren't into much smoke in the 60s and 70s. So now they're into smoke. So you see it starting to come back a little more.
Yeah. So among the sort of all of the sort of legendary distilleries in Speyside, you said Macallan is your neighbor, and I know there are a bunch of others. What are the differences in taste? Why do they taste so different?
Well, kind of what I just talked about those components of those barrels, right? So like for us, we use 2 barrels when we're making our Glenlivet 12. That's a bourbon barrel and an Oloroso sherry barrel. Now, using those, we're going to also...
So the barrels are it.
The barrels are it. So double maturation. If you look at your bottle, they'll say double maturation. So we're using 2 barrels. Now, what are we getting from American oak? We're getting that butterscotch, toffee, vanilla. Those sweet notes that we're going to get from that butterscotch, right? What are we going to get from that European oak? We're going to get a little touch of spice, but we're also going to get some creaminess. And that's what we want, that nice creamy note. I mean, Glenlivet 12 is what I would say is a stepping stone into getting into finer whiskeys. As you get up into our 15 or 18, you get much more. And we're talking about our Founders Reserve or even our Caribbean Reserve. I always say those are drinking whiskeys. You can mix them. You can drink them with your friends. You can have highballs. You can drink it neat, however you want, right? As we get older into 12, 15, 18, these are going to be more thinking whiskeys. I say it especially as we get into the 18-year-old because it's just got a lot of body going on. The whiskeys are older. So to touch upon the laws in Scotland, all right? So you have to be aged for 3 years and kept in an oak cask for 3 years, made 100% barley in Scotland to be called Scotch, all right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a bottle and you have oops, wrong way. If you have a number on your bottle, which way am I going? That way, there we go. If you have a number on your bottle, so 12 on the Glenlivet 12, that's the youngest whiskey in that bottle, all right? So by law, that's a law. So by law, whatever that number is on that bottle, that's the youngest whiskey in that bottle, all right? So what's the oldest? It's going to be about 15 years old, all right? So we just let you know what's the youngest whiskey in that that bottle. So you'll see some 18-year-olds. We have an 18-year-old. Those can go up to 21, 25 years old. So I always tell people, you know, I represent a lot of whiskeys from all over the world. So I love them all. But the laws are very strong in Scotland and Ireland about that age. Here in the United States, we're a little more free about it. But also, because of where we're mostly produced in Kentucky and in warmer regions, we really can't age a whiskey too long like we can in Ireland or Scotland, where it's a more temperate climate, right? It's not so hot and cold during your summers and winters. It's pretty much the same. So it's easier to age those older whiskeys. So I just want to let people know, just so you know, when you see a bottle, Glenlivet 12, that's the youngest whiskey in that bottle. All right.
What's the rarest Glenlivet? I mean, what's sort of what's the
rarest?
The holy grail of Glenlivet.
Well, Glenlivet, we've been around for a long time. Obviously,
yeah.
we launched here in the United States in the 1930s. We were actually the first single malt to come into the United States after Prohibition. Which is the main reason I think that we're the #1 selling Scotch in the United States. But it's also because we came back, you know, and we showed a lot of love for it. But I think that what comes to, I forgot. Can you ask the question again? I got.
Oh, just the rarest, the sort of the.
Okay, so the rarest. So going
the
to
ultimate
the thing, the oldest that we have that we release every 2 years, and we just released one last year, is a Glenlivet 50-year-old.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. So the first time that I saw that was in 2016 for one of the releases, and Alan Winchester, our master distiller, who's been at the helm since the 1975, pretty much Obi-Wan Kenobi of master distillers. He released this whiskey, but he, you know, of course, he wasn't the master distiller then. We had another gentleman that laid it down. So I was like, all right, so 1964 or 1966, this was laid down. So you had the Beatles were #1. All this crazy stuff. So did you say, hey, 2016, we're going to release this as a 50-year-old? Well, no, we had no idea, right?
Yeah.
So that one comes in at $25,000 a bottle. It sells out. We only release 100 bottles for the world.
Wow.
We do have, with permanent editions, we have Glenlivet 25, Glenlivet 21, 18, 15, 14, all the way down. And then we have, here in California, which I am hoping most of you are in, we only have a barrel that I chose for the state of California, Glenlivet 14-year-old single cask 100% Oloroso sherry. That's at cask strength. That's a delicious one. And then another one that we do have in the market as well is the Glenlivet Enigma. Now, the Glenlivet Enigma, this is part of our mystery malt series. This is Alan Winchester, kind of challenging whiskey drinkers and connoisseurs. And this is our 4th release of what's in the bottle. If you look at the bottle, it's black. There's no notes on it. There's no age statement on it. There's nothing that says anything. He wants you to see what you think it is. How old do you think it is? What barrels is it aging in? And you can go online to theglenlivet.com and you'll see, you join into our Enigma crossword puzzle. You put in your notes and they'll let you know where you place around the world competing with everybody. And
really?
they'll release the notes and they'll let you know as you do that. It's a really cool game, and you know, the first couple were just released in Europe and in other countries, and everyone kind of made a big stink about it. And the last came in, and it's been going really great because it challenges people, and especially like during this time, it's a really cool thing to do whiskey tastings with, because nobody really knows until you go in and you do this.
Are you able to sort of identify what it is?
Well, I mean, I have my notes, right? I don't know yet either. And well, I do know, but the thing is like when I decipher it is like what I said earlier about that American oak, right? That's going to be sweet butterscotch toffee. So when you're tasting something, you're like, all right, I got butterscotch. There's American oak in there, right? So then you're like, all right, so European oak. European oak is very vague because you can say, right, Spanish oak. We have French oak. Is it Limousin oak? Is it? You know, there's different. But you always have this subtle spice to European oak, and that's when you can kind of, you know, get it through. But then you have to taste for, was something aged in this oak? Was it a virgin cask? So you have to kind of, you know, you have to play, and it's a fun challenge. And you know, the whole reason that this came up was he's kind of a rocker on the side as well, right? He loves music, and he always is saying, okay, so right now we're in the comfort of our home, we're smelling whiskey. It's a really calm environment, right? So say you and I go to an AC/DC concert and we taste Glenlivet 12, it's going to smell and taste and be much different because of what's going on around us.
Sure.
All of our sensory overload is coming in. So it makes a big difference how calm you are, where you're at, what you've tasted. I always tell people when I do these tastings, if this was early morning and we woke up and we did this tasting, our palates would be kind of fresh, right? But you've had a burrito, you've maybe smoked a cigarette, had a glass of wine, your palate right now isn't going to be great. So I always tell people, just taste and don't like, I don't taste vanilla. It's okay. If you say, hey, I taste a Tootsie Pop, that may be your descriptor, and that's fine. I always tell people, you'll find your vocabulary the more you taste, and you find descriptors. Like, I mean, it's funny when people taste wine and they're like, ooh, it smells like cat pee. I'm like, well, that's not the best descriptor, but I get it. I totally get it, and I understand it.
So for the people who don't drink it straight, what are your sort of go-to cocktails to make with the Glenlivet?
That's a good question. So
yeah,
and for you people at home right now, sipping on Glenlivet or even Power Maker's Mark, and you're like, why would you mix this? Don't mix it. Listen, it's my whiskey. I can do what I want, and it's your whiskey. You can do what you want at that point, right? You want to put Dr. Pepper in it? Don't do it. But I'm just saying you can do what you want. Now, we can talk about classics all day, right? Old Fashions, Manhattans, such and such and such and such. Well, with the flavor profile that we have in our single malts, with our Founders and our Caribbean Reserve, it's easier to mix because I always like to say there's no age statement on it, so you're not feeling, oh my God, this thing's 15 years old. Should I really be mixing it? Well, I always say if it takes a delicate hand to mix these, so doing a stirred cocktail with this, like I'm a very big fan of the Rob Roy and a very big fan of the Rusty Nail, which is a very classic Scotch drink, mostly for after dinner. Very nice and made right. It's a gorgeous drink, right? Now it's certain things like that you can mix. Right now it's hot toddy season, so everyone's getting crazy with the eggnogs, with your hot apple ciders, with your just your regular toddies. Right now you have a flavor profile, you have different ABVs. Now you also today, at your house you may have different honeys. Think about it. You have different honey, you have different tea. These are going to make different toddies. You can have fun with it without being too crazy. I always just like to put a crock pot with some apple cider in it, throw some cinnamon, cloves, and anise in it, and then that is a virgin drink on its own, but I can add whatever I want to it to make it beautiful. And the whiskeys always make it better.
So what's your perfect hot toddy then? If I'm gonna make, you're gonna tell somebody make a hot toddy for me. This is what you do.
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, so my hot toddy, I actually do like it with a little more heat. So I would probably go more with like a Nadura Glenlivet, which has a little more, it's cast strength, right? But I'm only going to add probably about 1.5 ounces. Now I'm going to use a lot of hot water. Now citrus, I would just use a Meyer lemon. Here in California, we're very lucky. A lot of you have those in your backyard. So cut those down. That's going to have a nice little sweetness to it. Now I would say clover honey right now because that's going to help out with that citrus. But you guys can get crazy. Lavender honey is great too when it gets too cold. That one helps and it kind of calms you down. But with the clover honey, and then it's just a nice, it just sits, it's not too complicated. That's what I like. If you want to get crazy, if you get crazy, it's easier to do it with like apple cider. So hot apple cider, I kind of prepare that like I would. So you add the whiskey, you add the spices to it, you make that in your hot toddy glass or whatever, and then you get a dollop of whipped cream and put that on top of that with shaved cinnamon, and it's delicious. It's absolutely delicious.
Right? I don't think I've had one with whipped cream before.
Yeah, and you'll thank me later.
I'm sure I will. Actually, we have a question. We have a question from Margaret, who's asking, "What's the best glass to drink Glenlivet, the Glenlivet from?"
This is a great question. So I'm drinking out of a Glencairn glass. The Glencairn glass is always pretty much, you will see this in every whiskey professional's hand, or any whiskey festival or any bar that really appreciates their spirit, not just whiskey. Glencairn, there's also the Norland glass, but also, hey, I'm a big fan of the heavy rocks glass. Nothing wrong with that. If it's, there you go. That's a classic. It's good. I wouldn't use plastic. Don't use plastic. Don't use plastic at all. Just use it. Glass is good. Glass is great. And okay, so now we're going to talk about water. Now, water, I'm a big water geek. So with our water process, which is the same thing you heard with Phil about the limestone content that you get at Maker's Mark. So same thing with us. We have a high minerality content. Our well is called Josie's Well. She actually has a little white picket fence around her. She sits behind the distillery. We actually do give you bottles of water when you come to the distillery so you can taste with your whiskey. And it's a delicious experience. But I always tell people you should do it at room temperature, and make sure that it's a filtered water. if you're in the Bay Area, you have good water. LA, I'm not so sure, but you want use some filtered water or your Crystal Springs. It's great. And if you're using ice, which is absolutely fine, but just think about ice. It's like you being in a tank top going outside in the snow. You're gonna constrict. That's what that whiskey does. So you need to get a nice piece of ice that's made with distilled water. So if you go to your nice bars that have those big cubes, or at home with your silicone, you can make really nice cubes with either boiled water or just use that distilled water that I just talked about. You can make nice cubes and they'll slowly melt to open up your whiskey. If you're just using chip ice, that is going to pick up whatever's in your refrigerator and it's going to take those flavors and put it into your whiskey. It's also going to melt quick and kind of ruin your whiskey.
Wow. Okay. So tell me about the bottle customizations that you guys are doing, and also some of the new stuff. I feel like you guys have come out with a lot of new stuff lately.
To be honest with you, I've been with the company for a while, and it's so amazing to see what we've done in the last couple of years. Besides our new labels, we've had a couple of new releases. If you do happen to go on our website, theglenlivet.com, you can actually personalize your own Glenlivet label. So it will look exactly like this. What you do is you put whatever you want. You want to put Happy Birthday, Adam, Welcome to the Family, Merry Christmas, Mazel Tov. It'll still say Glenlivet, and it'll say your personal message. And it goes perfectly right over the bottle. It looks like it came from the distillery. And you just go on the line and you sign up and do that. It's really great. We'll send it to you.
Yeah. How long does that take to get the custom bottles?
I couldn't tell you exactly. I'm going to say yes, because that's a week away, and I don't want to be in trouble if they're like, why'd you say yes?
Right.
But if it happens, hey, congratulations.
Okay. And I know you guys have a couple other newer Caribbean 14-year. What are some of the new stuff you have coming out? You want to tell us about?
So we have the Glenlivet Founders Reserve. So this one came out about 4 years ago. And that one's going to use a lot of that first fill barrels that I was talking about, suburban. So I thought that's kind of like our stepping stone into single malt. You're coming in, you love bourbon, but you're not sure about that barley. This helps you get into it, right? Now after that we have the Glenlivet Caribbean Reserve. Now this is using rum casks from the Caribbean that we're using to finish our whiskey in for about 6 months. So it imparts a lot of these beautiful notes that you're going to get, like banana, and some of those notes that you're going to get in those delicious full-bodied Caribbean rums. After that, we have the 14, which is a year old now in our market. So the Glenlivet 14, this is going to be using a cognac cask to finish it. So we're using a really delicious, exquisite cognac to finish this in. And this is going to have that blackberry and plum as that finish goes. And then we have our classic, the one that started all the finishes, is the Glenlivet 15. It's been around since 1981. Yeah. Beautiful, awesome. This would actually be my Desert Island single malt, mainly because what we're using, we start with those 2 original barrels, and then that 3rd barrel is using a Limousin oak barrel that's a virgin. So Limousin oak, mainly used in Burgundian wines like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, makes a much creamier kind of finish. This is very elegant. I think this one is much more food friendly if you want to have your whiskey with some food. And then we go into what I call our bigger shouldered whiskeys. These are the whiskeys that I think that you're going to hold the whiskey to the light and say, what is in this bottle? Because it is magical. So that's the Glenlivet 18. That's 18. A really full-bodied Oloroso. Then we go from there to the 21, the 25, and then I don't have a 50, but that would be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. What's your favorite?
Ooh, well, the 15. That'd be my very.
15's your go-to.
The 15 would be my go-to, and then after that, I'm actually falling in love with the Glenlivet 14. It's just really, it's gorgeous. It's a sipping whiskey, and it's still fairly young for a single malt, right? But it isn't. It's 14 years old, so you still have a very full-bodied characteristic. But it also makes a delicious Sazerac, and so I'm really into that. Yeah,
that sounds good. All right, so I guess we have a trivia question for everybody before we go, and the first person to type the correct answer in the chat wins. I think you have to be in LA to win.
This is easy. If you're paying attention, you guys got this. Easy.
I'm sure they got this. They got this. Let's see. We're going to put it up on the screen. But the question is, who's the founder of the Glenlivet Single Malt Scotch? Alan Winchester, George Smith, or John Chivas? I think you got this if you were paying attention. Maybe Margaret. Who knows? We'll give them a second to answer. Dom, it's been a pleasure talking about single malt Scotch. If you could hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, and as we're waiting for you guys to weigh in, first one to weigh in.
We got a winner. We got a winner.
Oh, we got a winner. Joan Witten.
Winner.
Joan Witten, congratulations.
Congratulations.
What has Joan won? Joan has won the Glenlivet golf equipment package, which is fun.
Yeah, ooh, it's really nice. That's yeah. I'm jealous.
That sounds pretty nice. Dom, it's been great. It's been really fun.
Hey, this is my pleasure. I mean, we could have talked for hours about this. I mean, there's so much more to go into. Thank you very much for letting us be a part of this. As we say in Scotland, Slán Jamá. And remember, Scotch rocks, everybody.
Yeah, rocks. It does. But I hope next time we get to do this in person. I'd love to do that.
I would love that. I'll see you soon in LA.
All right, man. Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
So that concludes tonight's Whiskey Festival. Thanks to Phil and Dom for tonight's experience, as well as Baltair for the bites. A reminder that a portion of tonight's ticket sales will be benefiting Chef Cycle / No Kid Hungry, which is great. We hope you guys all join us in supporting restaurants in the upcoming days by ordering delivery through our presenting sponsor, Chow Now. Happy holidays. Thanks for being with us, and cheers. Good night.